So, Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm Nick Benequista, the Senior Director at the Center for International Media Assistance here at the National Endowment for Democracy. CIMA, as we're known, is a research and knowledge hub based here at the National Endowment for Democracy. And CIMA has a mission to act as a thought leader to guide international cooperation in support of free, independent, and pluralistic media around the world. This is our first in-person public event since the start of the pandemic, and we could not be more excited to be reopening our doors today to speak to you about some really exciting new research and to offer an extraordinary lineup of experts on media development from around the world. You all may have seen the most recent State of the Democracy report by International IDEA. That report says that the number of countries moving towards authoritarianism is more than double in the past 6 years, the number of countries moving toward democracy. So these openings, these bright spots, these transitions are very few and far between. And if we are going to reverse the declines that we have seen in media freedom and media development in the past 10 or 12 years, we have to take better advantage of these openings. So that's what this event is going to explore today, how to take greater advantage of opportunities to move the needle on media development. I'm going to kick things off today by introducing our first speaker and our panel moderator. Our first speaker, Ambassador Lisa Peterson, who is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, DRL. You'll find Ambassador Peterson's bio in the agenda on your seats. But we are truly grateful that she could be with us today to deliver opening remarks because she has vast experience tracking democratic transitions and human rights in a career that spans 30 plus years. Is that right? She's worked across Africa and in Latin America, former ambassador to Eswatini, and was the director for the Office of Multilateral and Global Affairs at DRL previously. She is also the representative of the U.S. at the Media Freedom Coalition, a coalition of 50 plus countries working to promote media freedom and development around the world, and an important new diplomatic initiative in our field. After Ambassador Peterson's opening remarks, CIMA Deputy Director Heather Gilberts will open the panel discussion. Heather has 15 years of experience in media development as a scholar, a researcher, an evaluator. She's worked at Carleton University, Internews, Freedom House, Search for Common Ground. She's well known to many of you. She's widely published. And together with Tarek Jusic, she led the research that we'll be presenting today on media support during times of upheaval. So with that, I'll hand over the floor to the ambassador, and thanks very much, everyone, for coming today.
Good morning, all, and thank you, Nick, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here at the Center for International Media Assistance, and thank you to CIMA for inviting me. I commend the Center for its crucial report on media reform amid political upheaval, which brings us together here today. We're witnessing democratic backsliding and a sustained decline in media freedom around the world across all forms of government. In response to the multitude of threats to democracy and human rights, the Biden-Harris administration has made democratic renewal a core tenet of its foreign policy, both at home and abroad. As President Biden has said, quote, "Democracy doesn't happen by accident. We have to defend it, fight for it, strengthen it, renew it," end quote. With allies and partners throughout the world, we must demonstrate democracy's unparalleled capacity to deliver for people and channel change peacefully. And despite concerning trend lines for global freedom, we're continually reminded that outcomes are not preordained and that circumstances can change quickly to create political openings for democratic revitalization. These openings are fragile and many are short-lived, but early and smart investments can result in long-term democratic gains. With good reason, media reform is a top priority during political openings. The democratic reform process often depends on reforms to the media sector. At the core of media freedom is the idea that information is a public good. Without a free and independent media, individuals are deprived of the information that empowers them to make informed decisions and hold governments accountable, whether through elections, exposing violations of human rights and corruption, or igniting debate around topics that might not otherwise be in the public eye. Media reform can also yield quicker gains by releasing imprisoned journalists, unblocking independent news websites, ending military control over the media, or abolishing censorship laws. Quicker gains than might happen in other areas of democratic reform. Some of these early gains can persist even if there's a later regression away from democracy. Providing early and sustained support to media reform during political openings is therefore a wise investment in our efforts to support democratic renewal. But we're also clear-eyed that enduring media reform that creates viable independent media systems is a complex task requiring sustained investment. The diverse cases discussed in this report, which have in common an authoritarian legacy and difficult paths of democratic transition, provide invaluable insights about media reform. These cases show us that successful media reform requires an inclusive and tailored approach. Media reform can't occur in a vacuum. It must be part of a broader, inclusive package of democratic reform. Too often, transitional governments propose tokenistic media reforms that never result in material progress. For media reform to take hold in a burgeoning democracy, it must be supported by strong, independent institutions that can create and enforce regulations protecting media freedom and freedom of expression. An inclusive approach to media freedom also requires a diverse and empowered civil society. The report notes that in all 5 case studies, the relative strength of civil society is a key factor in the success of media reform efforts. The work of civil society, through multi-stakeholder initiatives, coalitions, press councils, and grassroots efforts, is particularly important in settings with weak government institutions. Civil society is integral at all stages of media reform. It articulates and communicates the public's vision for media freedom, mobilizes and coordinates participation from national and international actors, and serves as a watchdog scrutinizing the government's actions. To build viable independent media systems, we must prioritize our work with civil society. Media reform has the best chance of taking root when we identify effective civil society organizations early and provide continuous and calibrated assistance throughout the reform process. Successful media reform also requires a tailored approach. There is not a one-size-fits-all way to advance media reform. We must support experts on the ground and consider the local and contextual realities of each political opening. The technical media assistance or trainings for professional journalism that we provide in one setting may not make sense for another. And whatever assistance that we do provide must be in close coordination with all other actors providing support to avoid duplication of efforts or conflicting approaches. Recognizing the importance of media reform to democracy, the United States is leading in making investments to promote free and independent media across the globe. The Summit for Democracy and current Year of Action are at the heart of the Biden-Harris administration's efforts to advance democratic renewal globally. President Biden will co-host a second Summit for Democracy in March 2023, and like last year's summit, will bring together governments, civil society, and the private sector to deepen discourse on the challenges to democracy and to chart paths where collective action can spur democratic renewal. At the first summit, President Biden announced supporting free and independent media as a key theme of the Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal, a landmark set of policy and foreign assistance efforts to bolster democracy globally. Together with partners throughout the world, the United States is hard at work advancing media reform. Recognizing that we're strongest when we work with our partners, the United States has deepened our engagement with the Media Freedom Coalition, a like-minded group of 51 countries that advocates for media freedom, particularly in repressive media environments, and draws attention to journalists under threat. We're also investing up to $47.5 million for programs that support free and independent media. The United States is investing up to $3.5 million to launch a journalism protection platform that will promote and protect open and resilient information ecosystems by addressing critical needs for at-risk journalists, enhancing the impact of investigative journalism, and bolstering outlets' resilience to legal and regulatory challenges. We're also providing up to $9 million to support Reporters Mutual, a program that will offer liability coverage for journalists and news organizations targeted with unjust litigation. And to bolster independent media, we're contributing up to $30 million to the International Fund for Public Interest Media, which will provide financial assistance to media in resource-poor and fragile settings, and up to $5 million to improve economic viability of independent media outlets around the globe. These contributions underscore how seriously we take media reform. We know that supporting sustainable reform is a long game that will require tenacity and flexibility. The United States is committed to making the needed investments to advance free and independent media, both in countries experiencing political openings and elsewhere. So I thank you for inviting me to join today's discussion, and I look forward to hearing from the expert panelists.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Peterson. Those were really, truly excellent opening remarks. It's hard to follow that, that speech. As Nick mentioned, my name is Heather Gilberts, Deputy Director of the Center for International Media Assistance, and I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to moderate this event today. As has been mentioned, this event was born out of a research project that CIMA has been conducting over the past couple of years, which really looked at the challenges and opportunities of building vibrant independent media sectors in countries where political transitions provide new opportunities for democratic renewal and reform. And we looked at current and historical examples as part of this research. Ukraine after the Euromaidan Revolution, Burma during the movement for democracy in 2011, and Tunisia after the Arab Spring. And we also looked at Sudan and Ethiopia, which were just getting underway in their democratic transitions at the time. And it provided an opportunity to examine media reform processes in the early stages and as they unfolded in real time. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any speakers speaking about Ethiopia or Sudan today, but we do have copies of the case studies printed that you can grab on your way out. But all of these cases document how, when old regimes fall, independent media advocates, human rights defenders, and government reformers often use this moment to advance a vision for democracy. And in many cases, as we will hear today, undeniable progress is made, driven by the courage and tireless efforts of those groups, but also bolstered in many cases by international assistance, cooperation, and solidarity. But what we also found, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that in the media sector, advocates trying to advance a vision for independent media face truly formidable challenges and predictable setbacks. Weak institutions, as Ambassador Peterson mentioned, poor safeguards for media freedom and media independence, and the legacy of the past, which is often vying for power, pose significant stumbling blocks. And after initial progress, reforms often stagnate or even reverse, as we'll see in many of the cases here today. So today's event is framed within the context of this research, and speakers will discuss the successes, the failures, and even the future opportunities to support the media sector in countries that at one time experienced a political opening, even if that democratic progress has since stalled or been derailed. So without further delay, I'm truly delighted to introduce our stellar lineup of speakers. In person with us today at the end is Silvio Wasteboard, who will provide discussant remarks. Silvio is the director and professor of the School of Media and Public Policy at George Washington University, and he is the author and editor of 18 books and articles on journalism, politics, media, and communication for social change. And beside me, we have John Knaus, who is the senior director for Asia here at the Endowment, where he oversees NED's grant making in the region. And he has extensive experience working with civil society throughout Asia, and he'll be discussing the reform movement in Burma, where he has traveled and worked extensively. And then online, we have several panelists as well. We have Salua Guzani Usladi, who works at Article 19 as the regional director for the Middle East and North Africa, where she leads the organization's programs on freedom of expression and access to information in Tunisia and the MENA region. And she'll be discussing the media reform movement in Tunisia after the Jasmine Revolution. Antonina Cherevko was one of the Ukraine case study authors for our research. And she is a human rights lawyer and international development expert who specializes in media law, freedom of expression, and media policy. She has also served as the head of the Independent Media Council in Ukraine, and she'll be discussing media reform efforts in the country since 2014. And then last but not least, online we have Tarek Jusic, who was the lead researcher for the CIMA study. And he is a scholar, consultant, and practitioner whose work focuses on the link between media transformation and democratic consolidation in post-authoritarian contexts. He is a full-time lecturer at the School of Communication and Media at the University of New York and Prague. And Tarek will be drawing broader lessons from the CIMA research, as well as his extensive work on media democratization in the Western Balkans. So with that, I'd like to kick off our discussion today by focusing on the successes. Given that these moments are often very volatile, it's very easy to go quickly towards the failures. But in each of the countries represented here today, there were many successes in the media reform process that are worth documenting. So I'd like to start, John, with you. When a window of opportunity arose in Burma, 2010, 2011, how did local media advocates seize the moment? And what were the main ingredients to success?
Great, thank you very much, Heather. I really appreciate this opportunity. Before I answer that question, I do want to commend the author of the report, Jane McElhoyne, on the report. It has a lot of great recommendations, and it really lays out the situation in Burma. And in a very difficult time when Jane was writing, which was right as the coup was going on as well. I also want to thank the NED's Burma team, whose input and analysis I couldn't have done this without. So I really do appreciate that. When we talk about success during the reform period in Burma, for the media, I think there are a couple of administrative things that happened and then a couple of other things that happened. Administratively, two really important things that happened were the abolishment of the pre-publication censorship law. This allowed media organizations to begin publishing what they wanted without having to go through a censor every time they published. Also, registration was made much easier for media outlets. This was especially significant for ethnic media outlets who did not have to register in Burmese. They could register in their own language. And this had become a huge obstacle for a lot of the ethnic media in the country. With that, ethnic media became much more mainstream in the country. It was no longer thought of the media just for ethnic minorities, but was accepted and relied upon around the country and allowed for reporting from other parts of the country rather than just the Burman main heartland. Also, during this period, there was integration of the exile media into the local media landscape. Obviously, there was some competition as people came in from exile, but this was mostly welcome. But they were mostly welcomed back. Local media knew the landscape, but the exile media really brought back new techniques, new training, as well as new technology. Also, the press councils that were created by the journalists themselves gave them space and were much more successful than those that were donor created and encouraged the journalists to work with the government. These journalist created councils really felt like an opportunity and a space for the journalists to talk about problems and to really advocate for what their needs were. And finally, the openness allowed for a culture of investigative journalism to develop, and the media became a watchdog on those in political power. The media reports were much easier to understand by the public than the reports by a lot of the civil society groups that we support, who are very technical and very, very detailed. The media could boil it down and be really helpful for the public to understand all of the issues that were going on during the transition. And with that, I'm going to move on.
Great, yeah, thank you so much.
Sure. Oh, yeah.
As we'll see as we talk about the future opportunities in Burma, a lot of those early successes are continuing to pay dividends, even in the extremely difficult situation we find ourselves in today. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now I'd like to turn online to Antonina from Ukraine. There were many successes in the Ukrainian media reform effort documented in this study, not the least of which was the integration of media into a broad-based civil society movement for democratic progress, the reanimation package of reforms. Could you speak a little bit, Antonina, about some of those successes and how they happened?
Yes, of course, and thank you very much, first of all, for having me. And in the first place, thank you very much for including, I think, extremely interesting Ukrainian case into the whole body of this important research. Well, I think when we're talking about successes, there are certain very let's say material ones, like subject related, and there are then certain which I would call like procedural ones. And where we talk about like material successes, that obviously in 2014 we had this window of opportunity, and we had the situation where in general, not only about media, but over 80 progressive laws were adopted, and these laws were basically proposed and developed with a huge input from the civil society. Among those laws were there was a comprehensive media law reform, which included public service broadcasting, which included transparency of media ownership, and reform of the formerly state-owned print press. Obviously, that would have not been possible without many years of preparations. And if we talk about, for instance, public service broadcasting reform, and this is the case study in our Ukrainian chapter of the report, then we can trace this reform back to 90s. So this is really a long-standing process, and generally this is one thing that I really would like to stress here, that for any media reform to be successful, I mean, you should be prepared to a marathon. This is not a sprint run. This is always a very, very long process. Talking about procedural, let's say, as I call them, successes, then one you've already mentioned here, and I think it's a very important one. It's integration of media reform agenda into the overall reform agenda. But I would also talk about an incredibly important role that civil society generally plays in Ukraine, and used to play, and is still playing in Ukraine in terms of the law reform process. Here, I would maybe argue that, in a sense, Ukraine is a very interesting and unique example where civil society often would be, like civil society experts often would be among the authors of the legislation. Normally, even if you look at the well-established democracy, you will see that government, parliament are drafting the legislation, and then they discuss this legislation or solicit comments from the civil society. In Ukraine, very often it was actually the fact that civil society has been working on the reform agenda and also has been working on the actual texts of the laws, and then basically working with the legislator and working with the government to make this draft legislation and draft initiatives a reality. And in this regard, of course, integration of media law reform agenda into the overall reform agenda, and the role of civil society as drivers behind this process, I would say those are great successes. Those are quite unique, and those are also very sustainable successes in a sense, because that's a situation that's been there for years. And even before the revolution of dignity, even before Euromaidan, civil society together with media still managed, to advocate for certain media reforms, such as, for instance, access to public information reform as early as in 2011, which again, testifies to the significance of these procedural successes.
Great, thank you very much, Antonina. Ukraine is a really illustrative case study, so I encourage all of you to look at it. And a few things that you highlighted was both the high capacity of the civil society sector. There was a lot of international assistance going into Ukraine supporting civil society and the media sector prior to 2014. And as Antonina highlighted, there were several waves of reform. 2014 is what we think about as when things really started. We saw real progress, but there were prior waves all the way from the 1990s, which are documented in the report as well. So now I'd like to turn to Tarek. Tarek, based on the CIMA research that you did, looking at the overall lessons across the 5 countries and your own experience in the Western Balkans, what would you summarize as some of the key ingredients to success?
Hello, everyone. It's a tough question, but maybe also straightforward. So maybe a few things. I guess one has to do with so key ingredients for success. Obviously, first one would be need for thorough, deep understanding of context, which is a precondition to really being able to recognize where reformers are. So those assisting democratization efforts, broader efforts, as well as those in media sector, should look for reformers wherever they are. We've seen some of our cases. Burma was one example where at some point a lot of work has been done with the governments only to realize that it's not going anywhere. So it was necessary to redirect the efforts towards civil society sector. So this is one, I think, important lesson. The second one is the one that's mentioned by Antonina, and it is any efforts that really try to achieve change or support democratization efforts meaningfully has to be long-term effort. And by long-term, we are really talking decades and probably more than 3, what we can see. So at least we are talking about a time span of some 30 years or so in contexts where there is no, at the very start of the reforms, there is no broad social consensus for the reforms, and where significant parts of anti-reform forces are still in the government or attached to the government. So a lot of resistance is to be expected, and this means that the process will be really long-term, with a lot of back and forth in this process in terms of retrenchment of authoritarian forces, and then rolling back reforms, and then pushing forward, and so on. So Ukraine is an excellent example of this. What we also see in the countries in Western Balkans is similar. I think we are in Tunisia now seeing for the last couple of years this retrenchment part. So after several years of significant progress, we see forces pushing, authoritarian forces pushing back. So this is another important aspect. So long term. And what else? I guess it is really fundamental to recognize that I think key obstacle, we can talk about capture and business interests and so on, but I think key obstacle, and we'll talk about it later, I guess, is that if those resisting change are in the government, the chances for any immediate success are close to 0. And extreme examples are again Sudan and Burma in our case, but also we see what is going on in other cases in our houses and in other countries elsewhere. So I think that for the start for me.
Great, thank you very much, Tarek. We'll come back to some of those issues quite soon. Quickly moving to Salua from Tunisia. Tunisia, as Tarek highlighted, was really a model of MENA reform, of media reform in the MENA region after the Arab Spring. So what initially went well and why? What were a couple of the successes?
Good morning or good afternoon. Thanks to CIMA for having me in this very important panel. Yes, so the Tunisian experience, mainly at the beginning of the Jasmine Revolution, was a very inspired experience in the MENA region. And I would say that the 3-4 years were very successful, where the media stakeholders were able to achieve many successes. I can start by what happened immediately after the revolution. I mean, in February 2011, when the National Authority for the Reform of Information and Communication, known by its abbreviation as INRIC, was established by a decree. And this national authority was an independent body for the media and communication sector, completely different from what we have experienced under the previous political regime of Ben Ali. So this institution was in charge of the formulation of the visions capable of upgrading the media sector to the level of the goals of the Tunisian People's Revolution. As well as developing the media sector in a manner that enshrines freedom of opinion and freedom of expression, and preserve the right of Tunisian people to have free, independent, and pluralistic media sector. And this institution was able to achieve a lot of things at the beginning. So to mention a few, the Decree Law 115, which is the press code, and the Decree Law 116, which is the audiovisual communication law, where so INRIC was behind these two achievements. And these two laws were compatible with international standards. And they have led to a big transformation of the media sector in Tunisia, from a sector totally controlled by the government and used as a propaganda tool, to a very diversified sector governed by independent institutions, and where we can see in the media landscape, community media, local media, private media, like independent media, multimedia independent media, and also the public broadcasting services has seen a little progress compared to what we have seen under the previous regime. So one of the achievements was the creation of the independent regulatory institution, which is known by its abbreviation as HICA, on May 2013. And this was done after a successful advocacy campaign led by the Union of Journalists, but also supported by national and international organizations at that time. Also, later in 2022, the Press Council, which is the self-regulatory body supervising the ethical rules by journalists and media institutions, was also born after an establishment process that has taken a lot of time, maybe 10 years of reflection and discussions among the media sectors. And we always feel proud at Article 19 that we were the organization that pushed and supported the media sector in Tunisia to establish the Press Council, and which was like the only independent press council in the MENA region. So yeah, so the beginning of the revolution was giving us a lot of hope and a lot of love to make the media sector in Tunisia a great example for the whole region. But as Tarek mentioned it, so like we have seen a lot of challenges after 2015-16, and also mainly after July 21st, when the country is traversing a political shift, and seeing like a setback in the democracy in the country. And we will come back to that later, maybe. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Salua. I mean, the interesting thing that's been highlighted is both there's sort of the grassroots demand and a lot of grassroots civil society groups that are pushing forward, but there's also the need for structures. And in Tunisia, we saw that there was the development of different structures which then facilitated change. And then the second thing that I think was really interesting about Tunisia is how long it took. Again, 10 years of deliberations, of different consultations to figure out how to create the press council. So those are great points. So now I'd like to go into the challenges. And again, not spend too much time on this, so really sort of highlight what some of the key ones. But as we know, sustaining success over time is one of the main challenges, sustaining momentum for reform, changing political realities, shifting alliances, which we saw in all the cases, international aid priorities shift. These pose difficulties for the endurance of a reform process. So what were some of the challenges in the countries of focus? And John, I'll turn to you again first here.
Thanks, Heather. I think one of the biggest problems in Burma was that the pace of reform was very different for the government versus the donors on the outside. The government wanted to control the reform very much, keep it at its own pace. And I think there was so much excitement from the donors and from outside, and they wanted to make reform happen as quickly as possible and used all different approaches and brought in a lot of approaches. And I hate to say it, but a lot of cookie cutter approaches to the media reform were brought into the country. And I think they lacked the local context that the ambassador mentioned in her speech earlier. This was especially true, I think, in the push for sustainability of the media outlets. I can't tell you how many business plans I saw for a small ethnic media organization that had 3 or 4 employees that somehow was going to be sustainable based off of advertising. It just didn't make any sense in the Burmese context. And so I think when you're bringing in an approach, you have to make sure that it is really locally specific and it fits into the local context. I think in Burma as well, in the new media environment with social media, I think there was a decoupling of the advocacy that was done around the traditional media from the digital rights movement. And I think that as a consequence, ironically, a lot of journalists were detained under the new digital laws that came in with reform rather than the old traditional media laws that had been in place. I think there was also a question of how to fund advocacy with a government that didn't really truly want to reform. And the question became, when should the government or the media turn to more of a name and shame technique rather than to continue to work with the government? And I think Jane mentioned that quite a bit in her report. And finally, I think the government thought that the media should be a partner rather than independent or a watchdog. This was true before the coup with both the sort of quasi-civilian government and the NLD-led government. And it's become even worse after the coup. I think there's many people in the opposition right now who think that the media should only be reporting on the abuses of the military, their defeats, and not reporting on the opposition as well. And they put a tremendous amount of pressure on the exile media or the media that's still inside the country to only report on the problems of the military. And I think it's a huge problem.
Great, thank you very much, John. Salua, and I'd like to turn back to you. You hinted that there were all of these very, tremendous successes in Tunisia. However, again, sustaining them over time as new alliances were drawn and new actors came to power was a big challenge. Can you explain a couple of the key things that happened that really damaged that momentum for reform?
Yeah, sure. So I think, first of all, that one of the elements that slowed down the reform process between 2011 and 2021, I mean before the political shift, is this divergence of visions among the media stakeholders themselves. And this becomes particularly a big element and a critical element when the country has crossed the political shift. Because this was cultivated a lot by political actors. In this case, so the media stakeholders are not at all in agreement about their priorities. So they were not in agreement about their priorities, but now we are seeing that more and more. And so even I can say that the media sector is divided between who should support this new political political process and who are against this political process. And here, like the public interest media is completely lost in this division. This is one challenge. The second challenge is that, and this is what also is experiencing after 2021, is that international aid, in my view, is in most cases a short-term oriented support and cannot be easily adapted when the political realities change. So we are all now like traversing a phase of uncertainty and confusion about the future of the media sector, which is struggling only to survive because of the financial crisis, and because also the economic crisis of the country, and also the reduction of like the revenues from public advertising, and also the impact of social media platforms. So now Tunisian citizens are relying more on like social media platforms like Facebook, and they are not caring a lot about like the media sector itself. A third challenge that I can mention here also, when the political reality change, is the negative perception of international aid in general, and which can be fostered by politicians as a strategy to decrease pressure on them. So they will blame, they will criticize, they will accuse international aid in the name of independence or sovereignty, and which will also block the advancement of the ongoing reform processes, because sometimes they are completely depending from international aid. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Saloua. That last point is a really excellent one, that sometimes international aid can actually be weaponized against the media reform process. Antonina, I'd now like to turn to you. Of course, we heard about the many great successes in Ukraine, but what were some of the challenges in sustaining that momentum over time?
Well, I think one of the challenges is that we, especially in the media development sector, you know, donors and media development actors, we kind of tend to imagine change the linear process, and that's why we are even here. Like, I'm a little bit uncomfortable, frankly speaking, with the words of, you know, successes and setbacks, because change has never been a linear process. Is in the first place, it's also a historical process. It's not only political process. You know, one of the great thinkers, Abdullah Naim, he said that in order to have like sustainable change, you need to have public mobilization and social transformation. And social transformation, you know, you need, sometimes change happens due to complex reasons, you know, too quick, and it's too radical, and it needs time to be digested. But and in this whole, you know, long and non-linear marathon, what is important is actually to have your agenda ready, to work on your agenda, even at moments when you think you have no hope, when you think there will be never window of opportunity. You still need to be working at the background on preparing to this window of opportunity, because it's also one of the ingredients of success, which I kind of missed to mention, is that a window opportunity could only be, you know, seized by someone who has an agenda ready, who has something to suggest, and you need years of preparations to have this in place. So one of the things to sustain change is to be resilient, to be persistent, to be patient, not to give up, also not to professionally burn out, That's actually, it used to be like a very serious point when you work, for instance, and some of my colleagues who have been working on the reform of public service broadcasting for 20 years. It's not easy. Like, it's not easy even at the personal level to go through this kind of ups and downs, and to wait until the reform is actually fully established and then fully implemented and fully digested also by the society, including political elites, but also by the general public. So it's very much, to me, it's kind of very much your psychological attitude. And of course, for donors, it's also managerial attitude, because you shouldn't expect this, you shouldn't really think in terms of log frames, frankly speaking. No, that's why the theory of change has been introduced some years ago in donor environment, because log frames are completely, I mean, they cannot really be used for tracking success and progress of these long-term kind of reform processes. So it's been like less formalistic, I would say, more forward-looking, and also always ready for change. Like, if you have a window of opportunity, you need to be thinking about what if it's going to close down in some moment. If you don't have it, and you may not have it for 10, 20 years, you still need to be preparing for it.
Thank you, Antonina. Those are really excellent points. The social and cultural context is often forgotten. We think that this is a political transition, that we need to reform the laws and the policies and the institutions. However, as we saw in some of the cases not represented here today, but Ethiopia in particular, we saw that the change was pushed too quickly and didn't take into account some of the social and cultural issues. Tarek, do you have a few brief comments to make about some of the main challenges with maintaining momentum over time?
Just a few. Yes, I mean, Antonina gave a fantastic, made a fantastic few points on this. I would like to add to that, I think, because I don't think there is much point in just listing standard set of challenges that we all know about, like weak state, weak market, weak civil society. Everything is weak in this context normally. But I think I would just add 2 points to what Antonina just said. One is, so obviously what we are dealing with is a shift in political culture, meaning values and beliefs. And this is tremendously slow, long-term thing. And experiences from other contexts and studies have shown that in the context where introduced changes are not closely related to the underlying set of values and beliefs, what we will see is retrenchment. We'll see erosion of reforms in such contexts. So, for example, Western Balkans cases, especially countries like Bosnia, where there was significant international leverage to push through reforms, has shown that once this leverage and this pressure has gone, we see a backtracking of many of these reforms. Right? So we are dealing with issues of political culture and values, and this is really a tough thing. So talking about success in this regard is an open-ending. We are dealing with an open-ending process without clear outcome, timeline, or direction. So this is major challenge, I think, for all of the reformers. And this doesn't fit in the log frames, as Antonina said nicely. Another important thing, I think, also, again, to understand challenges, we really need to understand, again, what we consider to be success. So beyond our procedural, administrative, technical aspects with which we measure and identify success, I think one thing that was not mentioned here, and it's fundamental, I think, and I think Ukrainian case, but also Tunisian case show this, and Burma case also show this very vividly, and that the process itself and the actors within the process are also an indicator of success. So we have a country like Ukraine where we see a maturing of civil society to 3 decades, and maturing of their capacity and deepening of their capacity. So they become more and more able to come together, to negotiate, to build coalitions, and to push for change. At the same time, they become much more competent and capable internally to formulate the agenda, right? And then ultimately then to make an impact and actually enter the parliament and political processes when the time is right. And the time was right 2 decades later, right? So I think this is an important thing to look at to understand that what is happening with the actors, with the reformers, and with the process is one of the key indicators of success. Especially if we look at the early stages of openings that are quite unpredictable in terms of where the system will go. So that's from me for now.
Great, thank you very much, Tarek. And of course, what we saw in Sudan and Ethiopia was those conditions for success, those actors, those processes were not well developed and really struggled to get off the ground. Quite a difference from the other countries we looked at. So now I'd like to turn to my last set of questions, which is looking to the future. So all of the countries that we're currently talking about are facing new realities. So a retrenchment of the democratic process, internal conflict in some of the countries, and in the case of Ukraine, of course, an unprecedented external invasion. So what needs to be done now to protect the gains made over all of these decades of investment and of success in the media sector, or regain lost ground? And Antonina, I'm going to start with you. What needs to be done to protect the gains made in the Ukrainian media sector across all these decades, or regain lost ground given the current situation?
Well, I think a good thing is that Ukraine and Ukrainians have been demonstrating, like, I would say, unbelievable extreme levels of resilience in all fields, like in all sectors, in private business, in terms of like functioning of all institutions, and media are not an exception here. But still, it's a foreign invasion. It's a Russian aggression against Ukraine. It's a very serious and very large scale thing. And one thing that I think should be done absolutely is for media development actors to have a more holistic approach to safety and protection of media in times of conflict. I'll try to explain this in a way, because you see, for instance, now when we are talking about media safety and media protection, very often media donors, media development actors, they focus on providing equipment, which is good, and then they also focus on tracking these cases where journalists were killed while they were performing their professional duties, while they were reporting from the front line. However, you also need to see how, as a media development actor, you can address the broader picture. Like, we have over 200 media outlets being shut down because of the hostilities, because of the war, because they were pushed out of their regions and they had to shut down. We have over 40 journalists killed, out of which 30 plus were killed as combatants, because they had to volunteer and to go to army to protect their families instead of doing their journalistic work. And of course, for us, for many of us, I mean, for instance, organizations who work on protection of journalist safety, etc., they effectively stop to be journalists. But this is also great loss for the media sector. Like, we have now a couple of the most famous fantastic investigative journalists who volunteered and went to the front line. If, God forbids, if they're killed tomorrow, we are losing the best people. So, and this is as generally is a great loss for the sector in itself, and it should be addressed somehow. At least it should be thought about. We should not just disregard these people. Oh, if you, for instance, if you go, to the army, then we kind of don't take into account what kind of impact this is going to have over the media sector itself. So one thing is, of course, support to survival and resilience of media sector. The second thing is also support to creative development. We shouldn't forget that besides, like extreme challenges, war, pandemic, they also reveal, they kind of exacerbate trends that already existed in a sense. And Ukraine now is a good demonstration of this. Also, like transfer to, you can see these developments, you can see these dynamics in, for instance, media consumption. You can see these issues of media sustainability and from where media should and could get funding. In a sense, now Ukraine should be very closely watched because all these trends, they're also playing out with a high intensity. And we need to invest in creative development and creative thinking around these issues, which are not unique to Ukraine, because media sustainability, financial sustainability, of course, it's very high on agenda for Ukrainian media, but not only. It's very high on agenda for media worldwide, globally. So I think, in a sense, you can also use this as an opportunity, to work with the future challenges coming our way, at a broader, at a global level. And then, of course, also related to my first point, it's investing in people, investing in great journalists, in regional media, in young journalists who are now also deprived, in Ukraine of receiving being normally studying in the universities, because in energy infrastructure has been hit heavily. So in Kiev, for instance, my friends and my colleagues, they spent maybe only 2-3 days in a week with electricity and heating, and they still continue doing their job. So it's also making sure that we are, even now, are already forward looking. We are raising, we are investing in the future generations of journalists who are also going to come out of this war and of this overall crisis situation.
Great, thank you very much, Antonina. Now I'd like to turn to John. Given the unfortunate current situation in Burma, what needs to be done to kind of regain lost ground or protect the media sector moving forward?
Well, first, excuse me, I want to echo what was just said about Ukraine, in the sense, instead of it being a foreign invasion, unfortunately, now the aggressor is the country's own military. And much of the same things about what were said about the Ukrainian military media sector could be said about the Burmese media sector as well. Just a few other points that I want to stress. We need to continue to support media outlets, Burmese media outlets, whether they're inside the country or in exile, so they can continue to report on what's happening inside the country. And this means supporting core costs and not just project-based costs for these outlets. These people need livelihoods. They need offices wherever they are. They need computers. Everything has been taken from them, and they really do need core support as much as they can. I think also both donors and the media outlets themselves need to treat the citizen journalists and the stringers who are still inside the country as staff, and try to offer them as much protection as they would to full-time staff. I think a lot of times people are just gathering the information and not realizing the situation that they may be putting these stringers or citizens journalists in. I think journalism training needs to be continued so that there's a new batch of journalists who are ready to come in if there is an opportunity for the country to open up back up. And this training needs to be coupled with democracy and human rights training so that the media sector is put into a broader context, so that we can have that development that may take decades. And finally, I think we need to provide Burmese journalists with an opportunity to tell their story to international audiences right now. They can't do any domestic advocacy. The country is in a state of civil war. And they need to be able to talk about what they need as journalists, protection-wise, support-wise, to an international audience. And then finally, we need the military to return to the barracks, is the most important thing.
Great, thank you, John. We only have about 15 minutes left, so I do want to turn the floor over to Silvio to provide some discussant remarks. We'll have a chance to hear more from Tarek and Salua and all the panelists during the Q&A. Silvio will also moderate the Q&A, which we'll probably have time for a few questions from the audience. So over to you.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, I would like to make just a few remarks across the case studies. I'm not an expert on each case, but I think the way that I approach that, I think there are some valuable lessons for thinking about media development in a more strategic way. The summary report is particularly very clear on that, the need to think strategically. Let me elaborate on this. First of all, I think that what these documents show is the value of taking stock and conducting evaluation, because we cannot think strategically without understanding what has been done, with what results, with what impact. And this is particularly relevant in the context of what the ambassador mentioned earlier, democratic backsliding. I think that many of us typically find it sort of very disheartening what's happening in many countries around the world. But to find hope, I think that we need to know what has been done and what is the lasting legacy of the work that has been done for over 3 decades. And the authors actually give us enough to be hopeful about. Hopeful not just because, but because we need to understand and measure, assess what still is there, what is the social capital, the institutional capital that was built over the years, in spite of the bad news. Right? That's the first point. The second point that I get from these reports is the need to keep a bifocal view, that it is what has been said earlier, this is a marathon, this is a sort of a long game. So at the same time that we keep the eyes focused on what is happening right now, never lose sight of the fact, how is this connected to a longer term project of development and media reform, in spite of the circumstances that may derail or set back some of the early gains. Third, I think the summary report especially is very clear on this. What do we mean by having a strategic mindset? Strategic mindset is that what we do doesn't lose sight of why we're doing it. I think we have a long history in media development of just doing things, just being caught in the effervescence of the opportunities, the windows of opportunities, democratization waves. But at the same time, we should not lose sight of sort of what is the expected impact of what we're doing. And the reports talk about the need for understanding context, for understanding how we tailor strategies and tactics to the local conditions and the local opportunities. How do we move away from just building skills into building institutions and building policies? Building skills meaning, yes, as important as it is to build the skills of primarily historically journalists, we also need to be the skills of media advocacy, so media policy staff, as well as institutions. And this is what the strategic mindset means. And we cannot have a strategic mindset with something that Antonina mentioned, which is either a theory of change or more modestly a model of change. Otherwise, we're just doing things without understanding how things fit together in a bigger picture of expected model of change. And these 5 cases, I think, give us plenty of ideas to sort of build from the ground up or inductively a theory of change. I know we have been talking about theory of change for a long time, but actually refining a theory of change that is sensitive to backsliding, that is sensitive to the undoing of gains, or situations in which it's very difficult, almost impossible, like the situation in Burma that I was described, to actually have much success on the ground. And I will stop there with, to me, these are sort of the cross-cutting lessons from these cases. And I love the summaries in the sense of saying, this is what we have learned. So just in case you're feeling, hopeless or, what do we need to do now? Well, taking stock, I think, is a good thing, especially if there are so many fundamental obstacles to actually roll out programs that can only be implemented when there are those sort of windows of opportunity.
Thank you very much. Yeah, those are excellent points. We only have a few minutes left, so I would like to open up to the floor for any Q&A. We'll have to make it quite quick, but if anybody in the audience here today would like to ask a question or has a comment for our speakers. Yes, Susan. Yeah. Nice to see you, Susan.
Hi, my name's Susan Abbott, and I'm with the Democracy, Resilience, and Innovation team at USAID. And my question is about Silvio's last point about theories of change. And I wondered for the authors of the paper, if you think that democracy is the right frame to understand media development over the past 30 years. Partially from my own research, people have been questioning maybe if it's freedom rather than democracy. And if you could articulate what you think, like just briefly, the if-then statement, what would that be?
Thanks, Susan. Does anyone else have a question? We could take two at the same time. Yes, Jonathan Levy.
Thanks very much. I wondered if it would be possible to also address a question to Ambassador Peterson, because this was a really very interesting discussion. It seems to me that a lot of the needs actually come down to additional funding. And Ambassador Peterson mentioned a program that was going to provide up to $47 million, which to me seems like a relatively small amount of money. So I'm just wondering if she could comment on the prospects for possible increased financial support of these very, very worthy endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So let's start just quickly with the first question about how we frame our understanding of media development. Anyone online have a comment about that? Antonina, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I think I would have two comments. So first, Helman, of course, it's kind of, in a sense, it could be seducing to kind of drop the mentioning of democracy, not to irritate certain actors, and to talk about freedom in abstracto. But the problem for me then as a lawyer is that if we turn to this, then freedom could be also understood as a complete anarchy. In a sense, like we want it or not, but democracy historically is the way of governance which allows for more freedom, should allow, if it's a genuine democracy, for more freedom than other forms of governments. So of governance, sorry. So that's why we kind of tied to democracy. It's pretty universal. You know, it's not like, in my opinion, it's not about like being too Western or like imposing our worldview, etc. It's actually just pretty ancient and then pretty universal. So far, no better way has been invented. You know, or otherwise, you know, we can talk about, okay, if we just have freedom without any institutions and structures and governance whatsoever, well, it's an interesting concept, but I would say quite a dangerous one. But then the second point is that we also tied, I think, to democracy, because media and democracy used to be very, and they're still interrelated. And that's the story. Like, we care about media freedom, not because, you know, we are not discussing hairdressers' freedom or carpenters' freedom in the same way as we discuss media freedom, because media play a role in democracies. They help sustain this freedom. So if these two are not working in one kind of framework, then it's a little bit like art for the sake of the art. You know, it's not doing something for the sake of a better living. You know, it's just doing something just for the sake of doing it.
Thank you, Antonina. That was excellent. Quickly, and then I'll turn to you, Mark. We also have a closing speaker I'd like to give. Do you have a response, Ambassador Peterson, to Jonathan Levy's provocative question?
The short answer is completely agree that the sums that we get, even though we feel like we're getting more robust, they still feel like they're a drop in the ocean. Prospects for getting more, you know, I think your guess is as good as mine. I think we have seen, at least from the DRL side, we have seen a growth in the amount of funding that we get, but it still is small in comparison to the need and small in comparison to other investments that we make, such as humanitarian assistance. Many of us make the argument that those humanitarian investments are nothing without these other pieces, but it's still a bit of an uphill battle to get the kinds of resources that I think we would all like to have.
Thank you very much. So now I'd like to turn the floor over to our closing speaker, Rosary Tucci, who is here. Please come up to the podium. Rosary is the Acting Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Democracy, Rights, and Governance Center at USAID, and I can't think of a better person to close out this event today, given her career as an advocate and thought leader supporting democracy and human rights.
Great. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. All right. Well, first, thank you for the thought-provoking panel, and thank you for this report. I think it drives home a lot of the key messages that I see the global community rallying around, and that is that a vibrant independent media is critical for a functioning democracy, and oftentimes is at the first institutions to be attacked, captured, suppressed during backsliding. Yet I think we're trying to move beyond what happens too often is the media sector getting overlooked during these transitions. And so you really highlight what is needed in these moments. The role that they play in monitoring the progress, holding governments accountable. I mean, these are the key messages that we'll take away from this report. And also, Ambassador, you mentioned it too, that this can't be done in a vacuum. This is really, media work can't be siloed. It's really part of a larger transformative governance reform. And I think the report highlights that as well, this integrated approach. The report helps us to think about a lot of the pitfalls to avoid, whether that's paying lip service, as we talked about, the lack of public demand, media capture by state political parties, business interests, of course, the impact of military intervention, and weak market reforms as well. So really an array of issues that we have to consider in these moments. For us, I think as we step back, our next, as we think about how do we modernize our work, because that's really what we're trying to do here. How do we improve our response? And meet this moment? I think you're seeing a lot of our shifts aligned with the findings of the report. And a lot of ways that's comforting. It means we're on the right path, but obviously we have a long way to go. And just to reiterate some of the findings that I see that's aligning with our work, and obviously we have to go deeper into, but first, what we call at aid localization, right? How are we really increasing our support to local media organizations, having them lead the implementation, shifting more to leadership, ownership, decision-making, not supply-driven, I think, as the report mentioned. And this will also help avoid the weaponization, of how that's being perceived on the ground, if this is really coming from the bottom up. I think the report specifically highlighted doing a better job understanding the context, the political dynamics, and really tapping media sector assessments led by local experts. And so I think, we've got to think a little bit deeper about that. And of course, cementing local leadership. The second piece that I think the report told the story of, which I think aligns with some of the shifts you're seeing, is this systematic solutions. That's, aid talks about the systematic solutions, whether that's the enabling environment or the ecosystem, or how do we address the legal and regulatory issues around media and trying to find solutions that will make systematic changes beyond the individual support to media outlets. And I know the report talks a lot about, effective training, but even going beyond that, support for the enabling environment, as I said, investing in civil society capacity. So the reform vision is bolstered by a sector's ability to monitor the health of the media system and self-governance and fostering a culture of ethics and professionalism. So really, I think we take those points to heart. And just a couple other quick points. Building trust and facilitating demand. That facilitating demand, I think, really hit home, making sure that we're supporting the media's ability to build trust and participatory, inclusive engagement with citizens, and so that the citizens see their voices reflected in the media. And I know that was mentioned numerous times. how do we build these coalitions and these movements to ensure that the demand is there, and that ecosystem is created. I really enjoyed how Antonio also talked about the social transformation, right? This is a long-term effort. And so we just have to think more deeply about how we're building that demand over time. And I think those are just some of the other key messages that I heard coming out of this. You're shoring up state capacity to support the reforms. I think we have to think about how to do that a little bit more nuanced and maybe a technocratic approach that we've been applying. Clear message on the core support. I would think we've got a little bit of work to do there, but really, obviously, the direct support to the independent media in the times of entrenchment, lack of political will. But I think what was really crystallized is the long-term support. And I think, the Ukraine case has been making that statement for years, but it was also evident in the Tunisia case. This is the long game, and obviously, I'll get to that in just a second. How do we support the long game? So really, I think we're hearing a lot of it. We got a little bit of work to do. Ambassador, you already mentioned Reporters Shield. So the work that we're doing really to support journalists with liability coverage, access to pre-publication reviews, to even prevent legal action. So I think you're seeing some really interesting and innovative programs there. And of course, we'll continue the support for digital, physical, psychological, legal, and even financial support. The last point I would just make that I didn't see come out totally in the report, but that's really more on the international community, is really how do we broaden the tent? And this gets a little bit to the answer of funding. I think the way we're looking at this is how do you bring not just the government, but the private sector to the table, philanthropy to the table. And I think that's where you're seeing our efforts to inspire, persuade, encourage more actors, more stakeholders to come into the fold. You're seeing that in the media viability accelerator that we're creating, because this really is about the viability of media outlets. And I think that's the only point I would add, Silvio, to your comment about the strategic mindset. We're also applying like a business mindset to this, right? So that sustainability is there for these organizations long into the future. So just, how do we bring a broader set of actors into it? That was also IFPAM's goal, is we'll put up a certain amount of money, but also asking other donors to come to the table as well. So let me just conclude. Apologies for being a little bit over, but there was so much richness and I kept hearing these different points that I just wanted to make sure that you knew we were hearing them. And Tony, you mentioned it, the freedom of the press is not linear. This is a marathon. And we have to hold out hope that what we're doing now is laying the groundwork for maybe 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. But we have to continue to lay that groundwork for when the bright spots come and we can make a little bit of progress. So, just continuing in that spirit of hope and playing the long game. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosalie. That closes our event today. I'd like to thank everyone. In particular, we're very honored that we had Ambassador Peterson and Rosalie Tucci from the US government speaking today. And I'm deeply grateful to all of our speakers, Silvio, John, Antonina, Tarek, and Salua. And thank you to the audience for attending online and those in person. And then also deeply grateful to our CIMA staff, who this would not have happened without them, I guarantee it. So thank you very much, Andrea and Sasha, for being such stellar stewards of this event. Thank you, everyone.